Mainstream Media, broadcasting live from Studio B, right here from the Voice17104.com.
Chris.
Yes, sir.
All right. Are we good?
Yes, sir. Go right ahead.
All right. Greetings, my friends, and salutation. Welcome to the Richard James Show. Again, we're going to lift up some of the leadership within the country, some of the leadership that has brought us this far. You've heard me mention often, and when talking about leadership in the past, a gentleman by the name of Marcus Garvey. Marcus Garvey. And doing research for this show, even though I'm well acquainted with Garvey and some of the things that he was involved in and he did, I learned just how little I know or knew about this great leader. I often lift up a man by the name of Paul Robeson, who's a wonderful, wonderful leader, whose intellect was beyond reproach, Phi Beta Kappa, All-American. I mean, this guy was just brilliant. But when I look back at the true history of Marcus Garvey, and I look at the relationship that Marcus Garvey had with the working man and the common man, and with the masses of African and African Americans, I find that the greatest leader, the best organizer, the most creative leader, who had the largest movement, there hasn't been and there never was in this country a movement as large as Marcus Garvey. Marcus Garvey had millions of followers all over the world. He had chapters in South Africa. He had chapters in other parts of Africa. African leaders respected him, loved him, and considered him the father of Pan-Africanism. You know, back in the late 1800s, I think it was 1888, white nations, European nations, and thank goodness the United States was not a part of that, got together. Britain, France, Belgium, the Dutch, Spanish, got together to divide Africa and divide it among themselves, a land that didn't belong to them. They had already begun to colonize Africa. And they divided among themselves in the colonies. And Africans that resisted this colonization were often murdered, killed, brutalized, and treated like dogs. Well, Marcus Garvey opposed this. And because he opposed it, he faced the brutality of these European nations. And the sad thing is, and I won't tell you the whole story because I'm going to show you this video, and then we're going to go over the video and some of the things that happened. And to support him, some of our civil rights leaders who fought for civil rights were jealous, envious of this great man, and contributed to his downfall. And that's one of the most disturbing things to me. The fact that we helped the J. Edgar Hoover, who was a racist dog. Racist dog is what I said. One of the worst enemies of mankind that ever existed was the director of the FBI, one of the founding directors of the FBI, J. Edgar Hoover, who went after African Americans, and I'm sure contributed to the death of African Americans, leaders, and did everything he could to destroy the civil rights movement. Well, he cut his teeth, so to speak, on his going after Marcus Garvey. And all of this is documented. We're going to take a look at it. But thank goodness the FBI has come a long way. Back in those days, all of their, you had to be white to be an FBI agent. And the only individuals that worked for color with the FBI were informants. But you had to be solid, all white, and just as racist as you can be to be a member of the FBI back in the day. I tell you, it was a horrible thing, but thank goodness we've come a long, long way with the FBI. And since then, there's some positive things that have come out of that agency. But Marcus Garvey had, someone said, upwards to 4 million followers around the world. 4 million. He had chapters, at least 30 chapters throughout the United States. In the major cities had chapters of the Negro Improvement Association, the Negro Universal Improvement Association, which was his organization. Marcus Garvey was a leader. He respected women. That's one thing that I love about the Garvey movement, that his number 2 in command was a woman, Amy Garvey. So he respected the rights and the position of females who were involved in his movement. And he said his movement would be no movement without females. He had an organization called I think it's called the Black Cross, which was all female, who fed the hungry, who gave medical assistance to individuals who needed. This was part of the Garvey movement. He had his own newspaper in which he touted the movement and all the fine things that they were doing. I think in Black World, you see that in the video. Great man. He had his own steamship line. And had he had the support of some of our African-American leadership, I think he would have gone a whole lot farther and been able to get a whole lot more done than he was able to accomplish. What we're going to do is we're going to take a look at this video, and it's a long one, and we're going to check it out, and then we're going to come back in, and then we're going to go over some of the information that we found. And by the way, one thing before we go to the video, let's define nationalism, Black nationalism, because today we have a group of what they call white nationalists. And the term really, white nationalist means racist and pure white. Well, that's not when we talk about Black nationalism, and that's what Garvey was, a Black nationalist. We're talking about nation building. We're talking about building up the economy, the social structure. We're talking about the cultural thing, the religious thing. We're talking about a total nation thing. Not to the exclusion of white, but the inclusion of African Americans, and to do it ourselves. Now, one issue that we have sometimes with white liberals and who want to help us, they too assume that we're not able to do it ourselves, so they have to take it. And that's a problem. That's an issue, because it's not true. But we also are not racist, and we feel that it wasn't integration that caused the problem for us. It was racism and our inability, for example, economically to get the resources we needed to do the job. And our being blocked from getting those resources. And even in situations where we built up an economy, like Tulsa, Oklahoma, the so-called Black Wall Street, and the other communities, Roswell, Roosevelt down in Florida, the number of communities where we've done well with our economy, we've had racists to come and burn it down, murder our people in the street, simply because we're doing for ourselves. Black nationalism is not that. Black nationalists have never been involved in that kind of thing in this country, and never even been accused of being involved in that kind of thing in this country. No, we want to build up our community. We want to build up our businesses. We want to build up our social structure, not to the exclusion of whites, but the inclusion of African Americans. And one thing's true, during the period of segregation, we had institutions that we no longer had. We had a number of Black hospitals owned and operated by Black folks. We had one called Mercy Douglas in the city of Philadelphia, but all over the country we had Black hospitals. We no longer have those Black hospitals. We had Black schools that we put together. We had a number of things that we put together and organized for ourselves that we don't have. We had businesses of all kinds. So, we got to get back to one thing that is very important, and that's doing for ourselves. We've had a number of Black inventors, didn't have the resources of other people. We were able to make some accomplishment with business and with inventions that we've done ourselves. So it's a matter of inclusion, it's a matter of working together, it's a matter of doing for ourselves and building up what we call nationhood. It doesn't mean we're going to carve out a territory within the United States and call it the Black nation or African nation. No, not at all. The nation is where you are, working together, building together, putting together an economy. That's what we're talking about, nation. That's what we mean in this country. Okay, we have a wonderful video that we want to start with. We're going to show it now. Take care.
For 500 years, there has been a continuous search for identity by people of African descent in the United States, in the Caribbean, and across the world outside of the continent of Africa. Because it's in Africa that we can first find ourselves.
It's this deeply held idea that Black people would never be a part of the United States or of American society, and therefore should seek a home elsewhere, either in the immediate Western Hemisphere, and more importantly, for many, back to Africa.
While Garvey popularized the idea of an African homeland for Black people, he hardly invented it.
Garvey injected his movement with a very strong ideological, focus, and that was the difference. But Blacks, from the very beginning of slavery in this country, Blacks have attempted to organize very similar, movements.
I think you have to go back 2 centuries to Paul Cuffey, arguably the first Black millionaire, perhaps in late 18th and early 19th century terms. A shipbuilder, a merchant based in Philadelphia, who during the War of 1812 espoused the idea of Africans, newly freed African Americans returning to West Africa. In the early 19th century, African Americans, through the American Colonization Society, established Liberia. And over 20,000 African Americans, newly freed slaves, found their way and a home in West Africa.
There were movements to relocate African Americans to Latin America, to Liberia, to Central America, any number of places. And I suspect that Garvey, being the voracious reader that he was, probably had read about many of these things.
Garvey enlarged the vision of earlier repatriation movements. For Garvey, Africa was not merely a physical place, but the political, cultural, and spiritual embodiment of home for a people who were dispossessed.
What Garvey gave the Back to Africa movement was much more of an oppositional, anti-imperialist, anti-colonial movement that did not go begging to the colonialists to make concessions to us, but talked about organizing ourselves, organizing in Garvey's own mind an African empire to redeem Africa. It was a standing up, being independent. We are going to throw the white man out of Africa.
Going back to Africa meant first and foremost psychologically and culturally. That is, black people who had been brainwashed to deny their own African identity had to first go back to Africa through their own mentality. By reclaiming Africa and winning Africa in one's own mind, you could achieve political and cultural liberation no matter where you were as a person of African descent.
One thing that distinguishes Garveyism from other Pan-African movements that preceded his movement was the large working class base. There was a significant following of ordinary working people, people who work in industrial labor, sharecroppers, not just in the United States, but all over the globe. Garvey himself was a labor organizer, and his appeal really reached the masses.
Earl and Louise Little, a young working-class couple, were the typical Garveyite family. The Littles were fervent believers in Garvey's ideas and played an active role in the UNIA.
Earl Little was from the American South. Louise Little was from Grenada in the West Indies, and she had migrated to Montreal, Canada. They met in Montreal and married.
Earl Little was a minister who became involved in the Garvey movement in the early 1920s. He saw in Garvey, I think, the combination of a black messianic figure espousing a philosophy, reinforcing his idea of the destiny and the future of African American or of people of African descent.
Wherever the Littles and their growing family settled, Earl and Louise joined or started chapters of the UNIA.
The family gravitated throughout the Midwest, experienced the kind of racial discrimination and intimidation that other black Midwestern families felt, settling in the 1930s in Lansing, Michigan.
Louise Little was the secretary of the Lansing UNIA. She also wrote the reports of meetings and divisional activities for Garvey's Negro World.
The Littles were typical Garveyites, I suppose, in that they were ordinary working people who believed in race pride, who believed in race first, organizing around the institutions that could benefit black people as a whole. They weren't leaders in terms of being national leaders. They weren't the kind of race men and women who would hang out in circles with Du Bois and people like that. But instead, they were very local, committed, believers.
Earl Little preached the Garvey movement. His wife, his family, all of those who were connected to him were Garveyites, because he was talking about doing for self, eliminating oppression against people of African descent, developing their own churches, their own schools, controlling their own community. The white power structure saw this as threatening to the point where he was murdered. But that message was so powerful that it was magnified even in the next generation through his son, Malcolm Little, who ultimately became Minister Malcolm X.
Malcolm was infused literally by birth and by experience in terms of going through the rites of passage, if you will, as a young adult, and into being a advanced Garveyite, if you will.
Marcus Garvey wanted black women to look at themselves in a new way as beautiful. Because up to the time that Marcus Garvey came into the Harlems of America, black women were, what, domestics, seamstresses, nurses at the bottom of the rung of whatever service line there could be.
After you joined the government, you are convinced that you were somebody. It made you feel that you was valuable and you were worthwhile, and that you had something to live for. You had something even to die for if necessary. That's how important it was to be a part of the Garvey movement. That's how I felt, and until today, that's the way I feel.
The Garvey movement sought to counter negative images of black women. In contrast to the demeaning stereotypes of black women in American popular culture, in the UNIA, black women were revered, and their beauty was celebrated.
Garvey idealized women. He had a romantic view of the beautiful black woman, the black goddess, Africa herself as a woman, and he idealized women, and he wanted to place them on pedestals in a way of lifting them up from jobs like domestic service into middle-class life.
He published photographs in his newspaper, The Negro World, showing beautiful black women. He wrote a famous poem, for example, called The Black Woman, which begins, "Black Queen of Beauty, thou hast given color to the world.
Among other women, thou art royal and the fairest. Black men worship at thy virginal shrine of truest love. When Africa stood at the head of the elder nations, the gods used to travel from foreign lands to look at thee."
Garvey used the Negro World to promote a new aggressive image of black women in many ways. Perhaps the best known was the creation of a special women's page in the Negro World. That page opened up the newspaper to the voices of women in many interesting ways. They began to talk about the role of the black woman in the family, in politics, in the arts, in history.
At its peak, the UNIA counted thousands of women among its members. Many were drawn to an organization that offered opportunities denied them in the larger society.
One of the reasons that the Garvey movement was so attractive to black women was because it provided a space where they could gain the respect of their peers. They could imagine themselves in different kinds of positions of leadership where they could be respected. Some organizations, for example, might make dark-skinned black women feel uncomfortable. But women of every complexion, of every background, were embraced, particularly in the women's divisions.
At every step of the way, women were extremely prominent in the UNIA, both in its councils as well as in its auxiliaries. It had an official women's auxiliary, and probably the most prominent auxiliary was the Black Cross nurses, who symbolized the activism of women in the Garvey movement.
The Black Cross nurses, a women's auxiliary modeled on the Red Cross, was a highly respected unit of the UNIA. In addition to receiving training in first aid, Black Cross nurses visited the sick, operated food banks and meal programs, and played a major role in recruiting young women to the Garvey movement.
If one actually counts noses, probably 2/3 of the core of Garvey's supporters who did the envelopes, who passed out and circulated the Negro world, who actually built on the ground local institutions that reinforced and reached young people for Garvey were black women. And Garvey himself would have admitted this. In the early 1920s, before we had an FBI, we had a BI, a Bureau of Investigation. A young, ambitious, and unprincipled attorney named J. Edgar Hoover was hired in the BI, and one of his first assignments was to explore how to destroy the mass movement, revolutionary Pan-Africanist movement led by Marcus Garvey. J. Edgar Hoover learned the tactics of disruption, of surveillance, of the use of the law and the breaking of the law to destroy a legitimate social protest movement.
J. Edgar Hoover really got his start in the surveillance of black radicals. Hoover was the point man for monitoring and amassing an enormous file system. Among his very earliest cases was his pursuit of Marcus Garvey. J. Edgar Hoover had a particular thing in pursuing black leaders. It's partly psychological, it's partly social. It's also partly a reflection of Hoover's strange sense of morality. He felt that blacks had to be kept in check because if they weren't, they could contribute to the destabilizing of American morality. Harlem Stride Piano became the kind of musical soundtrack of Liberty Hall and the Garvey movement.
Fertile ground for artistic expression was also found in the pages of Garvey's highly successful weekly newspaper, The Negro World.
In the pages of The Negro World, many of the early writers who would become identified with the Harlem Renaissance were first published.
Garvey's Negro World has incredible writing. The power, the voice, the diversity of the newspaper is simply striking. And I think if Garvey did nothing else except to launch this vehicle of black analysis and opinion, his name would be known throughout black history for all time.
The aggressive political stance of the Garvey movement came to be reflected in the art and literature of the Harlem Renaissance.
One theme that runs through the Harlem Renaissance is the idea of the new Negro. And the new Negro, in some ways, is a proclamation of black people's insistence on self-defense, on fighting back against white racism, against imperialism. And much of the poetry and songs coming out of the Garvey movement really captured that theme.
African American artists began to use the black experience as the foundation of their creative expression.
You can't help but read Claude McKay's If We Must Die, written in 1919 during the Red Summer, without understanding the context of that poem. The fact that hundreds of African Americans were burned out of their homes, dozens lynched, murdered, some burned at the stake, burned alive in that summer. That the Ku Klux Klan by 1919 had over 1 million white members across this country, that it had taken over state legislatures.
If we must die, let it not be like hogs hunted and penned in an inglorious spot, while round us bark the mad and hungry dogs, making their mock at our accursed lot. Like men we'll face the murderous, cowardly pack, pressed to the wall, dying, but fighting back.
If We Must Die is a poem that says, basically, if I'm going to go out, let me go out fighting back rather than on my knees. And that theme ran through the Harlem Renaissance, it ran through black nationalist politics up until this day.
Amy Jakes, Marcus Garvey's second wife, played a major role in building and leading the UNIA. Her first encounter with Garvey signaled Jakes' dedication to her future husband's ideas.
My mother was born in Jamaica and grew up there, and then migrated to the United States and went to one of my father's meetings in Harlem. And this would have been about 1919. After the meeting, she spoke to him, asked him questions and so on and so forth. He invited her to Liberty Hall to see the place and whatnot. And she saw, you might say, the mess that the organization files were in and so on, because they really didn't have good secretarial help. And he appreciated her intelligence and her background. So he asked her to come to work for the organization, which she did.
I think she alienated a number of the men in the hierarchy of the UNIA because of her independence. And she had her own mouthpiece within the pages of the Negro World, because Garvey gave her an entire page called the Woman's Page to edit, and she took that under her control and really made it an institution within the Negro world.
She had a story, for example, about the first woman who swam across the English Channel. And so her motivation was to show women that there were not limitations to the roles that they could perform. And this was kind of subversive intent on the part of her newspaper.
There were great debates inside of Liberty Hall and great debates in the pages of the Negro World about the future stance of black women. Amy Jakes writes an incredible essay in the mid-20s that lampoons and lambasts black men and tells them that they're going to have to get out of the way and that black women will lead the black revolution.
We are tired of hearing Negro men say, "There's a better day coming," while they do nothing to usher in the day. We are becoming so impatient that we are getting in the front ranks and serve notice to the world that we will brush aside the halting, cowardly Negro leaders.
Amy Jakes steps up and plays a very strategic role in the defense of Garvey from 1923, when he is tried on charges of mail fraud. For example, it is Amy Jakes who edits and compiles and publishes the first volume of the Philosophy and Opinions of Marcus Garvey. That book really is a landmark in the history of the Garvey movement.
After Garvey's death in 1940, Amy Jakes Garvey worked tirelessly to promote his ideas until her own death in 1973.
Amy Jakes's role in keeping Garvey's legacy alive was very significant. In the 1960s, with the rise of black consciousness, black power, black assertiveness, black is beautiful, people increasingly wanted information about Garvey. She became the major actor in disseminating information about Garvey, and so was a really incredibly energetic resource and had a great opinion about what she understood as the interpreter of Garvey, and she made no bones about asserting her opinions.
Marcus Garvey changed the thinking of the world. He changed the thinking of black men in the United States, that we are Africans. He taught that wherever Africans are is Africa.
Marcus Garvey is a success. Men like Martin Luther King, Malcolm X, all of them took a page out of the UNIA.
Well, one, you can't understand African American politics, nor the politics of the African diaspora, without the history of the Universal Negro Improvement Association, and particularly Marcus Garvey's ideas. In some ways, Garvey was the template for black politics, whether you're talking about Jamaica and Haiti, for that matter, whether you're talking about the Rastafari movements in London, or if you're talking about organizations as distinct as, say, the NAACP. All black nationalist organizations, radical ones, conservative ones, draw somewhat from the Garvey legacy.
His organization crumbled and his businesses collapsed. But Marcus Garvey's impact on the cultural, political, and spiritual life of black people would persist long after his death. One group that played a major role in preserving Garvey's legacy emerged in his native Jamaica in the 1930s. They are known today as Rastafarians.
It's as if his legacy went underground. The Rastafarians are the people, more than anyone, I think, who kept alive his memory after 19...
Another group to inherit Garvey's legacy was the Nation of Islam, which was founded in the 1930s and thrived in the 1950s and 60s.
Ideologically, there's a strong correlation between the Garvey movement and the Nation of Islam movement. That movement would take over many of the ideological themes of Garvey's African redemption, African fundamentalism philosophy, the idea of a nation for black people, a religion for black people, an economic base for black people. All of these themes were already laid out by Garvey. What Elijah Muhammad contributed was an Islamic orientation.
I think Islam is one of the greatest religions of all time for our people in America. The so-called American Negro have to be completely re-educated.
Garvey's philosophy of black self-reliance would find its greatest champion in a man whose parents were Garveyites, the Nation of Islam's most charismatic leader, Malcolm X.
We are trapped in a vicious cycle of poverty, of ignorance, of apathy, of disease, and of death. And they have these old Uncle Tom Negro leaders coming to Harlem telling you and me that times are getting better. Your times will never get better until you make them better.
If you look at some of the rhetoric of Malcolm X, it almost is the same as Marcus Garvey. You look at the philosophy that Malcolm X followed, black nationalism, which he did not create, but he popularized it. That comes out of the Garvey movement. You know, when you're talking about doing for self, you know, building your own businesses, controlling your own community, that God is of African descent or a black person. Malcolm's philosophy of black nationalism ties in perfectly with the philosophy of Marcus Garvey.
It is not too exaggerated to say that without Garvey and Garveyism, there would have been no Malcolm X, because the foundation of Elijah Muhammad, Malcolm X, and Louis Farrakhan today is really Marcus Garvey.
African leaders seeking an end to European colonial rule after World War II would use Garvey's ideas as guiding principles for their own struggles. Leaders such as Jomo Kenyatta of Kenya, Steve Biko of South Africa, and Kwame Nkrumah of Ghana would embrace Garvey's philosophy of black unity and self-sufficiency.
Garvey left a legacy to Africans today of pride in being Africans, of pride in African culture and African civilization, of pride in being black. That is the legacy that he left for Africans.
Garvey had tremendous influence in various parts of Africa, not only West Africa, which many people point to, but also Southern Africa, Central Africa, East Africa. He was able to influence many individuals and many movements in these particular areas. Kwame Nkrumah probably stands out as one of the most important because Nkrumah became the first president of independent Ghana, which was formerly the Gold Coast.
The philosophy and opinions of Marcus Garvey had a profound impact on Kwame Nkrumah. Kwame Nkrumah studied in the United States at the end of the 1920s and in the 1930s. And he read quite a lot. And he talked about all these different books that he read, including Marx and so on. But he said quite explicitly that the book that had the greatest impact upon him and his thinking was The Philosophy and Opinions of Marcus Garvey.
The catchphrase, "Black is beautiful," popularized in the 1960s and 70s, had powerful roots in Garveyism.
When we were growing up, we were not allowed to play with white dolls. We had to have black dolls. Mr. Garvey made sure that people they even used to make black dolls. So from then on, you learn from a child to love black. And that's one of the things Mr. Garvey taught.
There are three colors on our flag, now brothers. One red, one black, and there's one green.
In the mid-60s, with the rise of black consciousness here in America, in particular black power and the aesthetic of black is beautiful, people realized that this was indeed the essential message of Garvey. It's as if in the 60s, Garvey's time had come.
The study of things black became a maximum pursuit by many of us, and Garvey was one of the major people that we looked at because of the realization that he has touched so many of us, whether we are from the Caribbean or from Africa or from the northern part of the United States or the southern part of the United States. We realized that in our families we had people who were Garveyites. This was an organization of uplifting black people. This was an organization that had a dream of a united Africa. This was an organization that had a dream of fighting white supremacy.
By the 1960s, 70s, and 80s, even if the name Marcus Garvey drops out, the fact is that black nationalism, all aspects of black nationalism, in some ways, is touched by Garvey's legacy. You know, the idea that of African redemption, the idea of black pride and pride in oneself, the idea of a revolution in the mind, that you have to change the way black people think in order to move forward to make any kind of revolution. That is the Garvey legacy.
On the morning of August 3rd, 1920, 46-year-old Jacob Mills shined his boots, polished his sword, and headed to Harlem in one of the biggest parades in New York's history.
As a young boy, to see my father in the parade was one of the greatest things in the world. I would be right there to see him put on his tunic, and I loved to see that sword that he carried. It really made me feel very proud of him.
Mills was one of 100,000 black people marching under the red, black, and green flag of the Universal Negro Improvement Association. The world had never seen anything like it. It was all the work of one man, Marcus Garvey.
Every window that your people's heads were out to see the Marcus Garvey parade. Most of them wanted to see Marcus Garvey. And he was very well decorated, his hats and the feathers, but he drove always in his automobile, sitting back.
At the age of 34, Garvey claimed millions of followers worldwide. His controversial goal, to create an independent black nation, made him one of the most powerful people in America and one of the most hated. The federal government targeted him as a threat to national security. Rival black leaders denounced him as a lunatic and a traitor to the race. But Garvey may have been his own worst enemy.
He wasn't one to take advice from others kindly. He made his own decisions, and he would rise or fall by the decisions that he made, because he was a supreme egotist.
Volatile and secretive, yet charismatic and visionary, Marcus Garvey changed forever the way black looked at themselves and the world.
Listen to this video. You can go on YouTube and see this video and complete it. It's about 144 minutes. It goes throughout his history, just to give you some of the things that you may have missed. Marcus Garvey was attacked by some of the so-called Negro leaders who were jealous and envious of Marcus Garvey. Sad thing, they were jealous and envious of each other. The boys constantly had battles with Booker T. There were things about Booker T that Garvey agreed with, and I agree. Booker T said, "Cast down your buckets where you may." In other words, do for yourself, build your own institutions. Booker T himself helped to build the Tuskegee Institute of Technology, which created a lot of farmers, a lot of business people. The Tuskegee Airmen, he did that. Marcus Garvey did some things that these folks who criticized him didn't come close to doing. He had his own newspaper, which was kind of standard. Folks had newspapers. But he had a newspaper that had tremendous circulation all over the world. And then if you read that newspaper, you know he had tremendous respect for African-American females. He also invested in steamship line. He had purchased 2 steamships and was about to purchase 3 steamships. If he had some support from some of our jealous, envious brothers, then possibly he could have been successful. In the meantime, the FBI is planning agents within his organization to try to undermine him, cut him down, even do harm to the steamships that he perpetuated. Eventually, he was charged with mail fraud. Mail fraud simply because when he was trying to raise money for the 3rd steamship, he went out solicitation for people to purchase bonds. And they questioned whether or not the jobs was legitimate. I think Garvey made a mistake when he decided to represent himself in court, when all of these folks were against him. And individuals who I still have some respect for. A. Philip Randolph was one. W. Boys was another. There were other individuals who did not show Garvey any respect. Paul Robeson was not one of them. Paul Robeson showed Garvey the greatest amount of respect. But Du Bois was an elitist. And the more I learned about him, you know, even though I know he did some great things, he wrote a book called The Philadelphia Negro. He also developed a book called when he lived in Ghana in Africa, Encyclopedia Africanus, and did some great things. But he also believed in what he called his talented tenth. He felt that equality and integration had a lot to do with your educational status. So he was that, but he would question anybody who rivaled him in terms of attention, like William Monroe Trotter was a person that he questioned. William Monroe Trotter was also a graduate of Harvard University. I think he came out after Du Bois. So some of these so-called Negro leaders had been taught to hate themselves. Garvey, on the other hand, taught African Americans to love themselves. There's nothing wrong with, in fact, it's a beautiful thing and a wonderful thing to be an African. So he preached that and sent that out to all people. And again, we'll just say this, his organization was throughout the world. And he was considered the father of Pan-Africanism. In other words, African coming together as a group to fight imperialism and colonialism. Kwame Nkrumah, who was the first president of a free African nation of Ghana, was a great believer and follower of Marcus Garvey. So was Jomo Kenyatta and some of the others. Pan-Africanism was the birth child of Marcus Garvey. Marcus Garvey was truly a great, great, great man. He organized individuals who were involved in labor. When he talked about business, he set up numerous businesses, particularly in Harlem. Set up numerous businesses and numerous chapters of his organization throughout the world. Steamship line, no Black had ever dreamed of in that particular era, establishing a steamship line. Marcus Garvey did that. And he was undermined constantly by some of our own people who worked as informants for the FBI and supported J. Edgar Hoover and his quest to destroy Marcus Garvey. Now, Marcus Garvey was charged with mail fraud, went to court, represented himself in court, was found guilty by white jurors and sent to for imprisonment for 7 years. Remember, white folks in this organization don't have any problems with sending Black folks to jail for 7 years. Remember, Nelson Mandela spent 27 years in prison and then later came out and became president of South Africa. Well, they wanted to make sure that didn't happen in the case with Marcus Garvey. Marcus Garvey was released after being 2 years in prison. And later deported from the United States. He was sent back to his home country where he came from, was Jamaica. And he was greeted, as a hero. Thousands and thousands of people turned out in support of Marcus Garvey. He went there and continued his worldwide movement. Now, just because he left the United States, his movement didn't necessarily fall apart. There are chapters of his organization which is on the upward swing now. And I was aware of, in Philadelphia, the Universal Negro Improvement Association had a chapter in North Philadelphia. And friends and relatives of mine participated in that chapter. The other thing that we want to mention, and I think we heard it in the video, is that individual organizations such as the Nation of Islam, Louis Farrakhan, the Honorable Elijah Muhammad, basically, if you look at the structure of their organization, very similar to Malcolm X. Only I felt that women were showing a whole lot more leadership to allowed to lead things more so than some Islamic organizations. Women were raised up with respect and love and given very, very important roles in the Garvey organization. As a matter of fact, Garvey, who was born in 1887 and died subsequently in 1940, which meant that he did not live a very long life, that he died in his late 50s. His wife, Amy, took over the organization and continued to push the philosophy and the opinions of her great husband. And she lived and continued to work with our organization to 1973. She was a great woman, and to show you what I'm saying is that the Garvey movement had no problem and using African females in leadership position. And the hatred that some people build up between the races was not a part of Garvey's program. According to what Booker T said, cast down your buckets where you may, it doesn't mean that you throw away your relationship with people of other ethnicities. Some of the relationships between white and blacks were very, very, very important. And separation is the way things are, not the way things that people want them to be. So that would happen. And just for your information, in terms of me and my show, personally, I don't think the problem has been integration. I think the problem has been racism and discrimination between our people. And we have got to pull together, both white and black, Jew and Gentile, in order to correct this problem of racism and discrimination as it exists in this particular nation. We have got to realize that people are people. And if we want people to come together, we've got to come together ourselves. We cannot support any kind of racist position. I try to clarify and let people know. For example, the 3 young college students that were murdered during the civil rights movement, 2 of those college students were Jewish. They were white. So we got to love each other and work together with each other. Nationhood means building up a nation. It means building up institutions economically, socially, and that kind of thing. It doesn't mean that you build it up on a racist foundation. You build it on a non-racist foundation. Well, we come down to the end of our broadcast. Now, I want to remind people that we're still in business. We still have African Paradise that exists in the Lebanon Valley Farmers Market. And we want you to come see us at African Paradise. We were able to get in at African Paradise some brand new jobs. Here's a promo. This is African Paradise. Take a look. We got clothing on your right-hand side. We got oils. We got tall giraffes, tall cats. We got beautiful original paintings. We got original masks. We got statues from Kenya. And we got a whole slew of African drums, beautiful African drums at realistic prices. So we need your help and your support. Please come down and support us. And believe me, you will not regret it. We will do everything we can to appease our wonderful, wonderful, wonderful customers. And by the way, I just want to say this, the governor of the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania and his supporters have presented a bill before the legislature to institutionalize diversity, to institutionalize anti-discrimination in contracts and employment within the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. We have executive orders now, but we need your support for this legislation. Wonderful piece of legislation. I may have told you that at one point, years ago, I was director of the Commonwealth Equal Opportunity Program under the late Governor Robert P. Casey Sr. And that's been my forte all these years. And we need your support with this legislation. We've got to institutionalize. Discrimination is not over. People still discriminate in hiring, in contracting. And we need to work together to make sure that's ended. And I'm tickled that this governor has seen fit to support legislation. We've never had legislation in the past, except for on the federal level, the 1964 Civil Rights Act. So now legislation is going to be presented. I understand it's on a bipartisan basis, whether Republican and Democrat, which it should be. And look forward. Make sure your representative, your senator, your congressman on the state level support this legislation. I hope you have learned something about Marcus Garvey. We have had some great leaders in this country. And one of the greatest organizers of all time was Marcus Mosiah Garvey. He did a wonderful job many, many years ago. And his wife continued the effort. Read more, learn more, go up on YouTube, check out his book on the legacy of Garvey, and let us know what you think about it. This is the Richard James Show. This is Richard James signing off. Thanking everyone, thanking the Thomases, Chris Thomas and his wife, Thomas, for allowing us to do this broadcast and to bring to you the truth. God bless you, and may heaven smile upon you. This is your neighbor and your friend, like in the words of the late, great Toby Young, and so long until we see you next time. Take care.
Thank you again for tuning in to the Richard James Show. Our African and our African American programs are set up to educate you on what's going on in this world. And thank you for taking out the time to listen. Let us hear from you sometime also. So this is your neighbor and your friend signing off. Until I see you again next week, and hear from you again next week. So long. God bless.
This is Carmen Henry Harris. You're listening to the Voice17104.com, faith-based, community-driven streaming media. Keep the faith and keep listening.